Welcome to the Cult of Intimacy. This is the file on Allison Mack. In 2001, she was the epitome of hope and optimism in Hollywood. The actress who played Chloe Sullivan, the brilliant, ever-loyal sidekick to Superman in the series Smallville. She was built on trust. She had accrued an estimated $7 million and the adoration of millions. On the surface, this was World One, the life of stardom and adulation. But behind the applause, behind the Teen Choice Awards she would regularly accept, a terrifying void was growing. This is what you need to understand when an actress, at the peak of her fame, confesses to a crippling, isolating truth that is the real horror story. She admitted, "I had the job, I had the dog, I had the car, everything that I thought I needed in order to be okay. Yet," she added, "I couldn't stand to be with my family for more than 2 hours at a time." She was socially functional but emotionally paralyzed. That was World 2, the isolation and the desperate craving for structure. The critical error Allison Mack made was believing the antidote to her deep-seated loneliness was more achievement or more fame. But what she truly lacked was genuine intimacy and an ethical roadmap. This is the central thesis of the NXIVM case. Cults do not seek failures, they seek successful, well-connected people deeply craving something money cannot buy. Authentic connection and purpose. And that emotional vulnerability, that perfect wound, was precisely what Keith Raniere, a manipulator posing as a self-help guru, was looking for. When Allison Mack finally attended her first NXIVM workshop in 2006, Keith Raniere didn't offer her a self-help course. He offered a meticulously crafted trap. Knowing who she was, he ordered his highest-ranking, wealthiest members to fly in on private planes and never leave her side. Experts call this love bombing. It is not love. It is a rapid manipulation technique designed to overwhelm your defenses with false validation. It convinces the victim that they have finally found the belonging they always craved. For Allison, this was the first time she felt truly seen, outside of the Hollywood machinery. But the manipulation had to be completed with a strike. Keith needed to break her down. When Allison spoke about her passion for her art, Keith delivered the ultimate psychological blow. He dismissed her deepest love, asking, "What if artistic endeavors were really bogus? What if art is just an excuse for those who couldn't do?" Mack's reaction was immediate. She laughed nervously, then broke down crying. This wasn't anger, this was psychological surrender. Keith had successfully triggered her deepest fear, the self-condemnation she had been avoiding her entire career. He had exposed the pain of her shadow, Carl Jung theory. And just like that, the highly successful actress became the perfect prey. The enemy wasn't some monster hiding in the shadows. The enemy was the man who promised to solve her pain by making her a great actress again. In the next act, we will dissect exactly how Keith Raniere used Neuro-Linguistic Programming, NLP, and the multi-level marketing structure to turn that psychological wound into a $1 million cult empire. We ended Act 1 with the disturbing paradox. Here was Allison Mack, a woman who stood at the pinnacle of what Western society defines as success. She possessed youth, beauty, fame, and a fortune estimated at $7 million. Yet, internally, she was bankrupt. This is the starting point of our psychological autopsy. When Mack stepped away from Hollywood in 2012, it wasn't merely a career break. It was a symptom of existential displacement. She described a crushing inability to feel safe, even within her own family. She admitted to being socially functional, charming at parties, engaging in interviews, but privately. She was paralyzed by a lack of internal direction. She was a vessel waiting to be filled. And nature, particularly the human psyche, abhors a vacuum. Keith Raniere understood this principle of physics better than anyone. He knew that a person drowning in the chaos of their own freedom doesn't want more choices. They want a map. They want certainty. When Allison Mack met Keith Raniere, he didn't offer her a role in a movie. He offered her a script for reality itself. For a woman who had spent her life pretending to be other people, the promise of finally finding her true self was the ultimate lure. But in the world of coercive control, the promise of finding yourself is often the first step in losing yourself completely.
We need to pause here and analyze the concept of the perfect victim. There is a misconception that cults recruit the weak, the unintelligent, or the desperate. This is statistically false. High control groups specifically target individuals who are high functioning but suffering from status ambiguity. Allison Mack had achieved her goals, yet felt unfulfilled. This created a state of cognitive dissonance. She thought, I have everything, so why am I miserable? Raniere provided the solution to that dissonance. He validated her misery. He told her, essentially, you are miserable because your success is shallow, and only I can teach you depth. By pathologizing her success, he made himself the cure.
To entrap someone as sophisticated as Mack, Raniere couldn't just start a religion. That would be too obvious. Instead, he built a corporation. Before NXIVM, there was Consumers Byline, a discount buying club that authorities shut down for being a pyramid scheme. Raniere learned a vital lesson from that failure. If you sell products, you get regulated by the government. But if you sell human potential, if you sell ethics, you become untouchable. He brought the structure of multi-level marketing into the realm of psychology. He created the Stripe Path. This wasn't just a ranking system, it was a psychological conditioning chamber, known in behavioral science as a Skinner box. Participants wore sashes of different colors to denote their rank within the organization. White for beginners, yellow for coaches, orange for proctors. To move up, to earn the validation of a new color, required two specific inputs: capital and recruitment. A 5-day intensive workshop could cost thousands of dollars to reach the upper echelons. To become a counselor with a blue sash required an investment of millions. The genius of this system was that it monetized the member's own ego.
This structure weaponizes a powerful psychological mechanism known as the sunk cost fallacy. This is a cognitive bias where an individual continues a behavior or endeavor as a result of previously invested resources, time, money, or effort. Imagine Allison Mack's trajectory. She invests $10,000, then $50,000, then $100,000. 5 years in, to admit that NXIVM is a fraud would require her to admit that she, a smart, successful, wealthy woman, had been conned out of a fortune. The human ego will do almost anything to avoid that level of shame. So, the brain rationalizes. It says, the breakthrough is just one more course away. I just need to work harder. It keeps you paying, but more importantly, it keeps you believing. The financial investment becomes a psychological handcuff.
At the center of this financial web sat a man who demanded to be called Vanguard, Keith Raniere. To the outside world, he looked like an unassuming, perhaps even disheveled, middle-aged man, but inside the bubble of NXIVM, a meticulously crafted mythology turned him into a god. He claimed to have an IQ of 240, one of the highest ever recorded in human history. He claimed to be a judo champion, a concert-level pianist by age 12, and a scientist who could manipulate weather patterns with his mind. Within the cult, no one was permitted to fact-check the Vanguard. These weren't just lies, they were the foundation of a total god complex. The rituals of NXIVM reinforced this hierarchy every single day. When Raniere entered a room, his inner circle grown women, successful professionals would rush to kiss him on the lips. Students were taught to bow when he approached. This wasn't professional respect, this was ritualized submission.
Psychologically, Keith Raniere exhibits the classic, dangerous traits of the dark triad: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy. But his specific brand was malignant narcissism. He didn't just want admiration, he wanted total dominance over the reality of others. By claiming an IQ of 240, he created an insurmountable intellectual power imbalance. If a follower disagreed with Keith, the logic of the cult wasn't that he might be wrong. It was that their inferior intelligence couldn't grasp his brilliance. This is a brilliant, if evil, defense mechanism. It preemptively invalidates all criticism. For Allison Mack, who constantly doubted her own intellect, despite her talent, Raniere wasn't just a teacher. He was an elevated being, the only entity capable of fixing her broken mind.
To understand the monster, we must look at the child. Keith Raniere didn't emerge fully formed as a cult leader. He was crafted. Born in 1960, he grew up in the suburbs of New York. From the beginning, there was a pattern of exceptionalism masquerading as neglect. His mother, an alcoholic, died when he was young. Psychologists suggest that the trauma of maternal abandonment often triggers a narcissistic wound. The child, feeling abandoned, constructs a false self that is grandiose and perfect to ensure they never feel small or helpless again. For Raniere, this false self was the smartest boy in the world. By age 13, he was already manipulating the adults around him. He didn't just learn judo, he learned leverage. He learned that if you can convince someone you know a secret they don't, you own them.
We see here the early formation of the Messiah complex. Raniere didn't just want to be smart. He wanted to be the source. In his early 20s, he targeted women specifically. He would date a woman, then date her mother, then date her sister. This wasn't just promiscuity, it was total envelopment. He needed to be the center of their entire family system. He practiced micro-cults long before NXIVM. He learned that if he could control a woman's diet and her sleep, he could control her loyalty. NXIVM was simply the industrial scaling of a pathology he had practiced in his bedroom for decades.
Before the philosophy, there was the greed. We mentioned his failed business, Consumer's Byline, but we didn't look closely enough at why it failed. It wasn't just bad math, it was theft. Raniere was already practicing the art of financial cannibalism. He didn't sell products, he sold the hope of wealth to people who were desperate. When the government shut him down, he didn't apologize. He declared that the government was suppressive and anti-human. This is a critical pivot point. The transition from con man to martyr, he convinced his followers that his failure was proof of his greatness, that he was too advanced for a corrupt world to understand. Allison Mack bought this narrative completely. She didn't see a failed businessman, she saw a persecuted savior. But a myth needs a language to sustain it. How do you convince a rational person to accept the irrational? You change the way they speak. Raniere and his partner, Nancy Salzman, were practitioners of Neuro-Linguistic Programming, NLP. While NLP can be used for therapy, in NXIVM, it was weaponized to induce a permanent state of doubt. In their executive success programs, ESP, they used a technique called reframing. If a student said, "I feel uncomfortable bowing to a man," a coach wouldn't argue the point. Instead, they would pivot. They would say, "That discomfort is interesting. It shows you have an issue with authority figures due to your past traumas. You are projecting your father issues onto Keith." Suddenly, your gut instinct, the biological alarm system meant to protect you, is redefined as a limiting belief. Your intuition becomes your enemy. Your doubt becomes proof of your sickness.
This is a sophisticated, institutionalized form of gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which a person seeks to sow seeds of doubt in a targeted individual, making them question their own memory, perception, or sanity. NXIVM did this systematically. They taught Allison Mack that her internal alarm system was broken. They disconnected her from her own intuition. When you can no longer trust your own feelings to tell you what is safe and what is dangerous, you become entirely dependent on the external source, the cult, to interpret reality for you. You are flying blind, and they are the only air traffic control. This state of dependency is the precursor to total obedience.
The indoctrination process began the moment you walked through the door of an intensive. New recruits, including Mack, were forced to complete the personal emotions inventory. This wasn't a standard questionnaire. It was an interrogation of the soul. They were asked to list their deepest regrets, their greatest fears, their most shameful sexual moments. They were told this was for growth. They were told this was to help them overcome their disintegrations. But in reality, this process is known in cult psychology as trauma dumping or forced vulnerability. By revealing these dark secrets in a group setting, a false sense of intimacy is manufactured instantly. You feel seen and accepted by the group despite your flaws, creating a powerful chemical bond.
But there is a darker, more Machiavellian purpose here. This information is collateral. In the world of intelligence and espionage, this is called compromat, compromising material. From day one, NXIVM was building a dossier on Allison Mack. They knew her insecurities about her body, her doubts about her talent, her secrets about her family. They knew exactly which buttons to push to make her compliant. This created a massive asymmetry of information. They knew everything about her. She knew only the lies they told about themselves. This imbalance is the bedrock of extortion. Even before the branding, before the slavery, she was already trapped by her own secrets.
When Mack attended that first weekend intensive in Vancouver, Raniere deployed a strategy reserved for high-value targets. He commanded his most attractive, wealthy, and successful members to fly in on private jets. Their orders were simple: surround her, validate her, never leave her side. They told her she was brilliant. They told her she was special. They told her she had a destiny that Hollywood could never understand. For a woman who felt isolated in the superficial world of celebrity, this attention was intoxicating. It was a drug, and I mean that literally.
We need to understand the biology here. Love bombing isn't just flattery. It triggers a neurochemical reaction. It floods the brain with dopamine, the pleasure chemical, and oxytocin, the bonding hormone. It creates a euphoric high, biologically similar to the rush of a new romance or cocaine use. The victim becomes addicted to the source of that validation. Raniere became the dealer. Once the target is hooked, the cult begins to withdraw the affection, introducing criticism and coldness. The victim then works harder and harder, obeys more and more, just to get that high back. It is the cycle of an abusive relationship played out on an organizational scale. Mack was chasing that initial high for the next decade.
The final lock on the mental prison was Raniere's philosophy of ethical hedonism and the no-victim doctrine. And he taught that there are no victims in this world, only people who choose to interpret events negatively. If you are raped, if you are abused, if you are defrauded, it is because you chose to be a victim. You are at cause.
This is perhaps the most dangerous distortion of all. It is a perverse twisting of Carl Jung's shadow work. Jung taught us to integrate our dark side to become whole. Raniere taught them to submit to his dark side to become ethical. By convincing Allison Mack that she was responsible for everything that happened to her, he absolved himself of all accountability. He weaponized her conscience against her. When he eventually abused her, she didn't blame him. She blamed herself for not being enlightened enough to accept it. This is the ultimate victory of the predator, when the prey believes they deserve to be eaten.
NBI 2015. The trap was set, the wound was open, the hook was in, and the mind was reprogrammed. Allison Mack was no longer a star, she was a satellite orbiting a black hole. And in the next act, we will see what happens when that satellite is asked to pull others into the darkness with her. We enter now into the heart of darkness. Acts 1 and 2 showed us how the victim was groomed. Act 3 is the autopsy of their enslavement. By 2015, Allison Mack was no longer just a recruiter, she was an architect of a prison without walls. She, along with Keith Raniere, conceived of a secret society within NXIVM. They called it DOS, Dominus Obsequious Sororium, Latin for master over slave women. The pitch was seductive in its ambiguity. Mack approached young women like India Oxenberg, who were already deeply invested in NXIVM, but struggling to advance, and offered them a golden ticket. She pitched DOS not as a cult, but as a black ops training program for the soul. She told them it was a worldwide sorority, a force for good that would hack their evolution and cure their weaknesses. But there was a catch. To enter, you had to agree to a lifetime vow of obedience. Note the terminology, not a contract, not a membership, but a vow. This language is religious. It moves the agreement from the realm of business to the realm of the sacred. When India Oxenberg hesitated, asking basic questions about her autonomy, can I still date? Can I see my family? Mack shut the door on her freedom with a single, chilling sentence. You need to ask me permission to do anything in your life. At this moment, a rational person might walk away. But remember, these women had already undergone months, sometimes years, of NLP conditioning. Their critical faculties were eroded. Mack framed this demand for total control not as slavery, but as discipline. She told them, I am taking the burden of choice away from you so you can focus on your growth. It was the ultimate gaslight. Slavery presented as freedom.
We must pause to dissect the psychology of the master-slave dynamic. In a healthy mentorship, the goal is the independence of the student. In a pathological master-slave dynamic, the goal is the annihilation of the student's self. Raniere and Mack were building what is known in sociology as a total institution, similar to a prison or a monastery, but enacted in the real world by demanding permission for every life act: eating, sleeping. Dating Mack was effectively inserting herself into the victim's executive processing. The victim stops thinking, what do I want to do? And starts thinking, what does master want me to do? This rewiring of the decision-making process creates a state of learned helplessness. The brain literally forgets how to function autonomously.
But psychological conditioning is fragile. People can wake up, people can rebel. Raniere knew this. He needed an insurance policy, a lock that couldn't be picked. He called it collateral. Before a recruit was allowed to know even the name of the group, they had to provide collateral. This was the price of admission. Mack demanded highly sensitive, irrevocable material. She asked for naked photographs. She asked for the deeds to their homes. She asked for the login credentials to their bank accounts. But the most insidious demand was for fabricated confessions. Mack instructed these women to write letters, signed and notarized, accusing their own family members of abuse that never happened, or letters confessing to crimes they had never committed. Imagine the scene: a young woman sitting in a room with her mentor, trembling, writing a letter that says, I stole money from my father's company. Knowing it's a lie, she hands it to Mack. Mack smiles. locks it in a safe, and says, "This is just to prove your commitment. It will never be used unless you leave." In that moment, the trap snaps shut. The recruit has handed over their reputation, their financial future, and their family relationships.
This is the weaponization of mutually assured destruction. In criminal psychology, we see this in organized crime syndicates, but rarely with this level of psychological sophistication. This is not just blackmail, it is identity hostage-taking. By holding these confessions, Mack held the power to destroy the victim's life instantly. This triggers a state of chronic cortisol activation. The victim lives in a perpetual state of fight or flight, but they can't fight, and they can't flee, so they freeze. They enter a state of paralysis where compliance is the only safety strategy. Furthermore, the act of giving the collateral creates a cognitive bind. The victim thinks, "I must really trust this person if I gave them this." To believe otherwise, to believe you gave a gun to your executioner, is too terrifying to contemplate. So the mind convinces itself that the master is benevolent, simply to survive the anxiety of the situation.
With the mind trapped by collateral, NXIVM moved to break the body. The next mechanism of compliance was the diet. Keith Raniere had a specific aesthetic preference. He liked women who looked like adolescents, thin, frail, weak. He codified this preference into a doctrine. He told the women of DOS that fat interferes with your energy and that hunger is a spiritual cleanser. Allison Mack, ever the loyal lieutenant, enforced a strict 500-calorie-a-day diet. To put that in perspective, a toddler needs more than 1,000 calories. 500 calories is an apple, a small salad, and a coffee. For an adult woman, for months on end, Mack framed this as character building. She told India Oxenberg that denying her hunger was a way to develop warrior discipline. But as the pounds dropped off, as the ribs began to show, something else was happening. The women were losing more than weight, they were losing their minds.
We need to look at the neuroscience of starvation. The human brain consumes about 20% of the body's energy, specifically glucose. When you starve the body, the brain enters a crisis state called metabolic conservation. The first thing to go is the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for complex logic, moral reasoning, and willpower. The brain shuts down expensive thinking to keep the heart beating. The victim literally loses the biological capacity to resist. They suffer from brain fog, confusion, and emotional volatility. Additionally, starvation increases ghrelin and cortisol hormones, which keeps the subject in a state of high anxiety and dependency. When Bonnie Peace saw Allison Mack and noted her emaciated frame, Mack defended it, saying, "Keith is measuring my calories." This is the voice of a starving brain clinging to the only source of authority it has left. She wasn't dieting, she was being systematically weakened to prevent rebellion.
If starvation weakened the body's walls, sleep deprivation was the battering ram that broke down the door of the mind. Keith Raniere operated on a vampire schedule. He slept during the day, while his inner circle managed his life, but he came alive at night. He instituted mandatory midnight volleyball games that would run until 4 or 5:00 in the morning. He would invite chosen women on walks that lasted until dawn. Within the cult, being chosen for a walk was framed as the highest honor, a chance to be alone with the smartest man in the world. But the reality was biological warfare. The women of DOS were expected to work all day, recruit all evening, and service Keith all night. They were surviving on 3, maybe 4 hours of sleep for months on end. They were existing in a twilight state, a waking nightmare where the line between reality and suggestion began to blur.
We must understand the pathology of circadian dysregulation. When you systematically deny a human being REM sleep, you are not just making them tired, You are inducing a state of temporary psychosis. During REM sleep, the brain processes emotional data and resets the neurochemical balance. Without it, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex, the center of logic and judgment, goes offline. In this state, the victim loses the ability to filter information. They become highly suggestible. A command that sounds insane at 2:00 p.m. sounds profound at 4:00 a.m. after 3 days of no sleep. Raniere kept them in this hypnagogic state intentionally. He wasn't teaching them. He was programming a hard drive that had no firewall. When Allison Mack told India Oxenberg to lean into the discomfort, she was speaking to a brain that was chemically incapable of resistance.
Let us zoom in. We talk about control and slavery in abstract terms, but what did a Tuesday look like for a slave in DOS? It was a regimen of calculated misery. 5:30 a.m. The alarm goes off. The first task is not to stretch or drink water, but to send the good morning master text. If the response time is 60 seconds late, punishment. 6:00 a.m. The cold shower. This wasn't a quick rinse. Slaves were instructed to stand under freezing water for 5-10 minutes. This induces thermal shock. The body shakes. The teeth chatter. The heart races. It is a physical reboot that keeps the nervous system in a state of shock before the day has even begun. 7:00 a.m. Breakfast, or rather, the absence of it. A slave might be allowed a single hard-boiled egg and a black coffee. They had to weigh themselves on a Wi-Fi connected scale that sent the data directly to their master. If the number was 0, 2 pounds over the limit, fasting for the rest of the day.
We must analyze the psychology of the microtask by filling every minute of the victim's day with arbitrary, difficult tasks weighing food, cold showers, text check-ins. The cult induces decision fatigue. The brain has a limited supply of willpower. If you spend all your energy forcing yourself to take a freezing shower and starving yourself, you have zero energy left to question why you are doing it. You are too busy surviving the routine to dismantle the prison. It is the banality of terror. Narrator. Then came the labor. Slaves weren't just recruiting. They were personal servants. Allison Mack demanded her slaves clean her house, buy her groceries, and even run her baths. But she framed it as service. She told them, by serving me, you are learning to serve humanity. India. Oxenberg recalls spending hours editing Keith Raniere's incoherent ramblings into readable text, trying to find wisdom in word salad. She recalls running errands until her feet bled, and through it all, the constant ping of the phone. The readiness drills didn't stop at work. A text could come at 2:00 p.m. during a meeting. It could come at 4:00 a.m. The slave lived with their phone strapped to their body like a pacemaker. To lose battery was to risk their soul.
Control is effective only if it is constant. To ensure that his slaves were never mentally free, even when they were physically apart, Mack implemented the readiness drills. At any moment during a family dinner, in the middle of a work meeting, or deep in the few hours of sleep they managed to get, a text would arrive. It simply asked, "Ready?" The slave had 60 seconds to reply. If they missed the window, or if they didn't reply with the proper protocol, "Ready?" Master, the consequences were immediate. They faced penance. Penance wasn't just a scolding. It was physical and psychological torture framed as discipline. Bonnie Pesse, a Star Wars actress who fell into the group, described her penance. She was forced to sleep on the hard floor for nights on end, right next to her comfortable bed where her husband slept. Others were forced to take ice-cold showers until they were hypothermic, or stand barefoot in the snow at 3:00 a.m.
This is the creation of a psychological panopticon. The panopticon is a prison design where the inmate can be watched at any moment, but they never know when, because they might be watched. They must act as if they are watched. 200. The readiness drills internalize the master's gaze. Allison Mack didn't need to be in the room to control India Oxenberg. The phone became the proxy for the master. This creates a state of chronic hypervigilance. The nervous system is locked in fight-or-flight mode permanently. Furthermore, the penance utilizes a technique called trauma coupling by associating failure with physical pain, cold, hard floors. The brain learns to fear disobedience on a visceral level, but by calling it penance, a religious term, Mack framed the pain as a path to redemption. This is the ultimate twist. The victim thanks the abuser for the punishment, believing it makes them stronger and purer.
By 2017, the women of DOS were starved, sleep-deprived, financially leveraged, and psychologically broken. They were ready for the final stage of ownership. Allison Mack told her slaves they were going to receive a tattoo. She sold it as a beautiful symbol of the four elements: earth, wind, fire, water. She told them it was a badge of honor, a sign of their commitment to the sorority. The ceremony took place in Mack's townhome in Albany. It was not a sterile tattoo parlor. It was a candlelight ritual in a bedroom. The women were told to strip naked. They were blindfolded. They were told to lie on a massage table, while other women held down their arms and legs. Then, a doctor, a member of the cult, entered the room, not with a tattoo needle, but with a surgical cauterizing pen. This serves to burn flesh, not ink it. As the hot metal touched their skin, the smell of burning human flesh filled the room. The women screamed. They cried. And as they writhed in agony, Allison Mack leaned over them, whispering a mantra that chills the blood. Feel the pain. Feel the love.
We have arrived at the absolute nadir of the human soul. This wasn't a tattoo. This was livestock branding. Historically, branding is done to cattle to mark ownership. It says, "This object belongs to me." The symbol itself was a final, cruel joke. It wasn't the elements. If you rotated the image, it clearly displayed the initials K.R. Keith Raniere and A.M. Allison Mack. They were carving their names into the flesh of these women. Psychologically, this ritual induced a state of dissociative trauma. The pain was so intense, and the context so confusing, being held down by sisters while being burned, that the mind fractures. To survive the moment, the victim must dissociate from their body. But the most dangerous element was the reframing of pain by chanting "Feel the pain, feel the love." Mack was actively rewiring the victim's neural pathways to associate agony with affection. This is the deepest form of trauma bonding. It ensures that in the future, when the master hurts them, the victim's brain interprets it as an act of intimacy. It is the psychological equivalent of fusing the nerve endings of pain and pleasure.
They said he was in this office.
The transformation was complete. The bright, bubbly actress from Smallville was gone. In her place stood a woman who could hold down a screaming friend while her skin was burned off, and call it love. The trap was sealed. These women were bound by the collateral in the safe. They were bound by the starvation that clouded their minds. They were bound by the fear of the midnight texts. And now, they were bound by the scar on their pelvis, a permanent, physical reminder that they no longer owned themselves. Keith Raniere had built a perfect machine of human exploitation. But like all machines built on suffering, it had a flaw. It relied on absolute silence, and silence, eventually, gets broken. In the next act, we will watch the walls crumble. We will see what happens when the slaves find their voices. And the Vanguard faces the one thing he couldn't manipulate: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Before the FBI arrived, the rot had already started from within. By 2017, the pressure in the pressure cooker was too high. The women were getting sick, not just tired, medically ill. Hair loss from malnutrition, cessation of menstrual cycles, chronic migraines. Allison Mack began to panic. We see this in her emails from the time. She wasn't worried about the women, she was worried about her quota. She wrote to Keith, complaining that her slaves were low energy and resistant. She didn't see their suffering, she saw insubordination. Keith's response was chilling. He told her to tighten the screws. He suggested more collateral, more pain. This marks the escalation phase. In criminology, when a predator feels they are losing control, they don't back down, they accelerate the abuse.
This is the extinction burst. Just before a system collapses, the behavior spikes in intensity. Raniere knew, on some level, that his empire was fragile. The branding wasn't just about ownership. It was a desperate attempt to lock the door because he sensed the draft coming in. He pushed Mack to be crueler because he needed to prove his power was absolute. But this cruelty was the catalyst for the defectors. It pushed Sarah Edmondson past the point of fear and into the realm of rage. And rage, unlike fear, motivates action.
Every tyranny relies on a single premise: silence. For years, NXIVM operated in the shadows, protected by non-disclosure agreements and the sheer terror of its members. But in 2017, the silence broke. Sarah Edmondson, a high-ranking member, looked in the mirror and finally saw the brand on her hip for what it was, not a symbol of elements, but the initials of her abuser. The spell of the Vanguard shattered against the reality of her own scarred flesh. She did the unthinkable. She went to the New York Times. When the story broke in October 2017, it wasn't just a scandal, it was a psychological earthquake within the cult. The headline, "Inside a Secretive Group," where women are branded, stripped away the mask of self-help and revealed the face of a sex cult.
We are witnessing here the phenomenon of de-idealization. For a cult member, the leader is an idealized object perfect, godlike. When undeniable evidence of abuse, the brand enters their consciousness, it creates a massive psychic conflict. They have two choices: deny reality to protect the leader, which many did, or confront the terrifying truth that they have been complicit in their own abuse. Sarah Edmondson chose the latter. This act requires breaking through the cognitive dissonance that Raniere had spent years building. It is an act of immense psychological violence against one's own belief system.
With the spotlight of the world turning toward Albany, Keith Raniere did what all cowards do when unmasked. He ran. He didn't stand and fight for his ethical principles. He fled to a luxury villa in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, dragging his most loyal subjects, including Allison Mack, with him. But even in exile, the manipulation didn't stop. It intensified. Isolated in Mexico, Raniere entered a phase of paranoia. He convinced Mack and the others that they were the victims of a global conspiracy. He spun a narrative of martyrdom.
Psychologically, Raniere was entering a state of narcissistic collapse. When a narcissist's false self, the genius Vanguard, is challenged by reality, they don't feel guilt. They feel rage and persecution. To stabilize his fragile ego, he needed his followers to affirm his grandeur more than ever. He demanded they abandon their lives, their families, and their laws to protect him. He was testing the limits of their trauma bond. He was essentially saying, if you love me, you will become a fugitive for me.
Hubris is almost always the downfall of the tyrant. While the FBI was hunting them, the cult members were still living in their delusional bubble of superiority. They believed they were smarter than the authorities. In March 2018, Nikki Klein, Another actress and member of the Inner Circle posted a video on Instagram. It was a simple, carefree moment of the group at a beachside party. She thought she was just sharing a memory. She didn't realize she was leaving a digital breadcrumb. The FBI didn't need psychic powers, they needed metadata. They tracked the IP address. They triangulated the location. The smartest man in the world was undone by a social media post.
This is a fascinating example of the omnipotence fantasy. The group had been told for so long that they were the vanguard of human evolution, superior to the suppressives of the outside world, that they lost touch with basic operational security. They underestimated the FBI because their worldview did not allow for an opponent who was smarter than Keith. It is a classic Jungian inflation. The ego swells so large, it blinds the individual to reality, leading inevitably to a fall.
The end did not come with a bang, but with a whimper. When the Mexican federal police stormed the villa, they expected to find a mastermind. They expected resistance. Instead, they found the women of the Inner Circle, terrified, trying to cover for him. And where was the Vanguard? Where was the man who claimed he could stop rain with his mind? He was found hiding in a walk-in closet, cowering behind designer clothes. The facade of the fearless leader evaporated in an instant. As police dragged him out, the women chased the car, screaming, desperate, watching their god being hauled away in handcuffs.
The image of Raniere in the closet is the ultimate psychological reveal. It exposes the shadow behind the persona. The persona was the fearless leader. The shadow was a terrified, inadequate child. For the followers watching this, it should have been the moment the spell broke. But notice their reaction. They chased the car. This is hysterical bonding. In a moment of crisis, the victim clings tighter to the abuser. They didn't see a criminal being arrested. They saw a martyr being crucified. Their brain protected them from the trauma of the truth by reframing the arrest as a tragedy, not a liberation.
Raniere was extradited to New York. 3 weeks later, the FBI arrested Allison Mack. The Smallville star was now inmate number 90838. The hierarchy crumbled. Nancy Salzman, the prefect, arrested. Claire Bronfman, the financier, arrested. The machine of NXIVM was dismantled piece by piece. But the psychological machinery inside the victims' heads, that was still running. As Allison Mack sat in her cell, facing decades in prison, she had to confront the question that would define the rest of her life. Was she a monster who enslaved women? Or was she just another slave who had been given a whip? In the final act, we will explore the aftermath, the trial, and the terrifying realization that for some, the cult never truly ends. You might think that with the leader in chains and the secrets exposed, the spell would break, but the human mind is stubborn. It does not let go of its gods easily. While Keith Raniere sat in the Metropolitan Detention Center awaiting sentencing, a group of loyalists gathered outside his window every single night. Among them was Nikki Klein, Allison Mack's wife. They weren't protesting, they were dancing. For 30 nights straight, they performed choreographed routines, moonwalking on the pavement, flashing car lights, trying to cheer up their vanguard. To the outside world, this looked like madness. Why dance for a monster? Why cling to a sinking ship?
This is a profound example of identity fusion. When a cult member's personal identity becomes indistinguishable from the group identity, an attack on the leader feels like a physical attack on the self. To admit Keith is a predator is to admit that their entire life, their friendships, their sacrifices, their brands was a lie. The pain of that realization is too great. So, they retreat into a shared psychosis folie à deux. The dancing isn't joy. It's a desperate psychological defense mechanism to keep the reality of their victimization at bay. They are dancing to drown out the silence of their own doubts.
Allison Mack, however, chose a different path. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and perhaps the clarity of isolation, she broke. She pled guilty to racketeering and conspiracy. On June 30th, 21, she stood before the judge. She didn't dance. She wept. In her statement, she said, "I am sorry to those of you that I brought into NXIVM. I am sorry I ever exposed you to the nefarious and emotionally abusive schemes of a twisted man." The judge sentenced her to 3 years in prison. It was a lenient sentence compared to the 120 years Raniere received, acknowledging her cooperation. But the judge also delivered a stinging truth. You capitalized on your celebrity. You demanded that these women give you the keys to the most intimate parts of themselves.
Allison Mack's breakdown in court is consistent with moral injury. This occurs when a person perpetrates, fails to prevent, or bears witness to acts that transgress their own deeply held moral beliefs. Once the spell of the cult broke, Mack had to confront the reality that she wasn't a savior. She was a slaver. The weight of that realization that she branded her friends is a psychological life sentence. While Raniere the psychopath feels no remorse, Mack, the manipulated empath, is left to carry the guilt for both of them.
The NXIVM case did more than send a few people to prison. It forced the American legal system to confront a blind spot. For decades, the law understood physical violence. If someone hits you, it's a crime. But what if they starve you? What if they blackmail you? What if they rewrite your reality until you can't say no? This is called coercive control. It is a pattern of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation that creates invisible chains. At the time of the trial, the US had no federal laws defining this, unlike the UK. NXIVM became the case study that proved psychological imprisonment is just as real and just as damaging as physical kidnapping.
This is the most important academic takeaway from this case. We must update our definition of violence. Keith Raniere didn't always use a gun. He used words, debt, and shame. Psychological abuse changes the architecture of the brain just as surely as a blow to the head. Recognizing coercive control in the courtroom is the first step toward protecting future victims who are trapped in prisons made of words.
Allison Mack entered prison a broken woman, leaving behind a legacy of both art and atrocity. Her story is a tragedy, but it is also a mirror.
We started this journey by asking how a girl next door could become a monster. The answer lies in the shadow of the human condition. We all crave connection. We all crave purpose. And in that craving, we are all vulnerable. Keith Raniere was not a magician. He was a mechanic of the human soul who knew which levers to pull. If there is one lesson to take from this dossier, it is this: protect your autonomy. Be wary of anyone who claims to have all the answers. Be skeptical of any group that demands you disconnect from your past to build your future. And most importantly, never surrender your internal compass to an external master. Evil does not always arrive with a scary face. Sometimes it arrives with a smile, a promise of excellence, and a question. Are you ready? I'm Dr. Alistair. Thank you for watching.